So first of all, just an outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about scandal and what does it mean in this context. And then who were Lady Loftus and Lady Mary Lygon, a little background on them. And then a bit more detail on Lady Loftus and the scandals around divorce and penury. Then on Lady Mary and scandals around the High Church, Bohemianism in particular, and nationalism. And then I'll come to some conclusions and relate them back to Kirsten Mackenzie's characteristics of a scandal. Scandal and its study. I want to acknowledge the work of Professor Kirsten Mackenzie at Sydney Uni, who's really done a lot of work in this area. And if you get to read any of her material on scandal, I'd recommend it to you. She makes the point that the late 19th century, which is one of Carol's nice periods there, is a time of massive social change. People are reinventing themselves all over the place. They're transgressing social boundaries, which themselves are also changing in the colonies and in Britain. There's a massive expansion of the British aristocracy during this period, mainly through infusions of people who've become newly wealthy. And a lot of that money comes from fairly obscure sources, but a lot of it is colonial money. So within that sort of a context, scandals are perhaps inevitable, but they also create networks of information that link the whole empire, especially through the printed press. Scandals can make the invisible visible, and they can leave traces in the historical record if we know what we're looking for. Some of the characteristics that have been identified by Kirsten Mackenzie are about shape-shifting and how one scandal can suddenly turn into a different one. They often are studded with silences and things that seem to leave no traces and can leave a question of whether they even happened. They can become political resources in public debates, and I'll touch upon all of these things. They can be catalysts for reform in periods of change, and you might like to think there of the scandals around child labour, which led to the introduction of child laws and the regulation of child labour. And in an area that's particularly of interest to Kirsten Mackenzie, imposters succeed when they play the roles that people expect. That's why they succeed. So all these long forgotten scandals in colonial societies, by studying them, we can get a sense of the texture and the drama of their times that makes these people real and alive. And you can see the little picture there from the Sydney Punch. If you're interested in scandal and its historical scandal, that's a great source for it in Sydney. So who were these two consorts? So Emma Lady Loftus, she's born in 1819 and died in 1902. She was a vicereine from 1880 to 85, so she was aged 61 to 66. And she was one of the older of the consorts. She was a consort to her husband, Lord Augustus Greville, and she herself had come from a fairly old naval family of the Grevilles. Most of her married life was spent as an ambassador's wife, especially in the various German kingdoms and in Russia. But she also moved in royal circles. As Carol had noted before, her sister was a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria, and her son, one of her sons, served as a page of honour to Queen Victoria. Although interestingly, again on a point Carol made, for all of this, the Loftuses were never particularly wealthy. And she is known in New South Wales for supporting the colonial divorce law amendments, so her support for the admission of women to the University of Sydney, and for the purchase of Hillview as a summer residence, and we'll come to them a little bit more. The other one, Lady Mary Lygon, born in 1869 and died in 1927, is a fairly different, quite a different woman. She was a consort between the ages of 30 and 31 in two different periods, one for 4 months in 1899 and another for 4 months, in 1900, to her brother, the Earl Beauchamp. She had those broken up periods because she was a lady in waiting in the royal court, and these were her periods of formal leave from the court to come to Sydney. Her younger brother, Earl Beauchamp, was only 27 when he was appointed as governor. So they came from an old noble family at Madresfield in Worcestershire. They were wealthy. Lady Mary spent most of her working life as a lady in waiting to Queen Mary, which really came after this part of her life. And she was well known supporting local musicians, artists and writers, women's charities, Anglican high church philanthropy, and country sports, which meant things like horse riding and so on. And she definitely did not ride a push bike. She thought it was unbecoming. So Lady Loftus, the divorce that surrounds her is not her own divorce, but the divorce of her namesake daughter, Emma. Emma had married the Honourable Frederick Wellesley, who was a nephew of the Duke of Wellington. And at the time that the Loftuses came to New South Wales, Wellesley had deserted his wife and he'd headed off to the continent with a well-known actress. And if you can see the newspaper cuttings there, you'll get a sense of what that was about and how that was reported. Emma Loftus Wellesley sued him for divorce on the grounds of desertion, but in order to bring him to court, they had to scour all over Europe to try to track him down and find him and bring him back to England to face the court. She won that case in 1882, and it was widely reported in Britain and in the colonial press. There's plenty of newspaper reporting of it in Sydney, in great and sordid detail about all the comings and goings of the husband and how wicked he was. This came at a particular fortunate time, I suppose. New South Wales, at the time the Loftuses arrived, was seeking to amend its divorce laws to allow a deserted wife to divorce her husband. But there were problems in the Colonial Office with approving this law, and it had been back and forwards between London and Sydney a number of times. Lady Loftus is credited with suggesting an amendment that was acceptable in Sydney and in London, and which was that the husband had to be resident in New South Wales when the wife was suing him for divorce, although the wife could be anywhere within the empire. The problem being that husbands, when they were being sued for divorce, would just go across the border to Victoria and were out of the reach of the courts here. So Lady Loftus is credited with making this suggested amendment, with influencing her husband and the Premier to put that to Parliament. It was passed in the Parliament and then went to London and was approved finally by the Colonial Office. And this is a great advance in divorce law in New South Wales. She's also credited with influencing her husband to argue with the Colonial Office to support a bill that allowed women to graduate from Sydney University. The purchase of Hillview was, the Premier at the time in the New South Wales Parliament argued this was to provide a retreat for the governor's family to do with health issues. And he was referring to Lady Loftus, who suffered from neuralgia, which is a chronic nerve pain in the face and the head. And treatments at the time included opium and arsenic preparation. So the treatment was as bad as the illness, I think. But this was provided as a justification for buying the house. And again, picking up on what Carol said before, the Loftuses' viceregal income was insufficient for them to purchase the house themselves and also to pay his numerous creditors in Europe. And you can see in that bottom newspaper article some reference to that. This was also a cause, along with the divorce, for a lot of tabloid gossip. And Lady Loftus was constantly portrayed as the victim in this, poor Lady Loftus. And in her later years, when they were back in England, Lady Loftus ran what was called a fashionable perfumery in London to actually pay the bills. You can see from those clippings there about the divorce and the financial difficulties and some of the detail and the way they were reported. As I said, Lady Loftus was constantly presented as poor Lady Loftus, but her responses to her daughter's public humiliation suggest otherwise. They'd point to a woman quite capable of exerting influence behind the scenes to bring about some long-term change. Lady Mary Lygon, as I said before, is quite a different kettle of fish. She was a consort to her brother, a bachelor brother, and it fairly quickly became clear when they arrived in Sydney that he was not, as they said in the papers, not the marrying kind or a confirmed bachelor. They brought with them a retinue, a huge retinue of footmen and household staff, as well as 3 lady companions for Lady Mary. And red and white was the Lygon livery colours. They were prominently displayed at all the functions they attended, And as you can see there, they decked the streets of Sydney in red and white. The Lygons had no financial problems. The Lygons encouraged a bohemian set at Government House, musicians, artists, writers, actors, in preference to established Sydney society. For example, they favoured Henry Lawson. They funded his visit to London in 1900, and Beecham was of the view Lawson was a great Australian poet. They also supported the Celtic revivalist poet Victor Daly, as well as numerous musicians and artists. This caused some divisions within the Bohemians about nationalist ideals versus the need for wealthy patronage, with some ridiculing the Lygons for having what they called Byronic marks and rejecting their patronage as unsuited to a colonial head of state. But the real problem here was about upsetting what were called the Darling Point Dowagers, or the Potts Point Mrs. Grundys. The favouring of the Bohemians and others over them came about when Lady Mary decided almost immediately to review the entire order of precedence at Government House and who was invited and where they were placed. In doing so, one of the people who felt they were snubbed was the French consul, and through him, the local French language newspaper, Le Courrier Australien, became their journal for critiquing Government House with a lot of vituperative chatter. The fact that the Beechams were fluent in French probably just added to that. They also converted a room in Government House to a chapel in what was called the Anglo-Catholic style, and were therefore constantly castigated in the tabloid press as secret Catholics. Beecham, before landing in Sydney, had quoted from Kipling's Song of the Cities the refrain, "Greetings, my birthstone have I turned to good." Now, he obviously meant this as a compliment that from dark beginnings a great new place had been born, but this was seized on by, in particular, John Norton, the editor of the Sydney Truth, who then maintained a campaign of harassment against both Beecham and Lady Mary, a snide commentary and blowhard denunciations of their character and lifestyles. He hounded Beecham as a bumptious fop and Lady Mary as an ice queen, and filled his pages with endless lurid tea tales of sexual peccadillos and social inversions at Government House going-ons from allegedly anonymous insiders. And that combination of Bohemianism, Anglo-Catholicism, and acknowledging the convict past made the Lygons a target for the tabloids, especially the Truth, but also others. The Bulletin was renowned for its response to that by saying, "For birthstains, take Beecham's pills," which, is a play on a popular medication at the time. But Lady Mary was a fashion icon in Sydney among young women, and the leading department stores copied her clothing and jewellery, branded them with Lygon names, and sold them throughout the colony, and you can see some examples there. Many of the Bohemians adored them, and the ecumenical Christians and social reformers admired them both. But it's only Norton's bullying nationalist excoriation of Beecham for his birthstone remark that was repeated in various ways in other journals, such as the Bulletin, and satirical works such as the Sydney and the Melbourne editions of Punch, that seems to be remembered today. And why is that? I'll come back to that shortly. So really, in some conclusions, Lady Loftus's pain over her daughter's desertion and divorce led her to propose a compromise to the New South Wales divorce law amendments, and also to support the admission of women to Sydney University. She influenced her husband in this acceptance of these reforms, and ultimately London's acceptance of them. She later, in the late 60s, although a titled former vicereine and ambassadress, had to run a shop to financially support the family. Rather than an aloof and distant woman, as some historians have characterised her, the scandals in her life suggest a woman who well understood the value of education and financial independence for women, and could exert influence to that end. Lady Mary Lygon and her brother were incessantly vilified and bullied by the Sydney tabloids, especially the Truth. Norton was an ardent nationalist who feared powerful women in any role, and including what he imagined would be a petticoat viceroyalty. And he was particularly affronted by Beecham's overt homosexuality, compounded by his reference to the convict past, which was itself an anathema to the nationalists, at the exact moment New South Wales entered into the new federation in 1901. Beecham did not really pretend to be other than who he was, and Lady Mary staunchly defended him, which further infuriated Norton, especially as Norton was himself both a High Church Anglican and, paradoxically, a foe of New South Wales Catholics. Unfortunately, nationalist Australian historians of the mid-20th century accepted Norton as a reliable source and gave generations of young people a caricature of an un-Australian convict-loving Pansy and his frigid sister as real historical characters that belie a much more complex and historically diverse viceroyalty with resonances for the 21st century. Going back to Kirsten Mackenzie's characteristics of scandal, we can see some things about shape-shifting, how a divorced daughter scandal segues into an undeserving genteel poverty. About the studying of things with silence and leaving no traces. Lady Loftus's influence in the divorce bill and the women's university admission is nebulous. It's inferred in records, but nowhere is that made explicit. And we need to better understand more about the way or the exercise of influence within viceregal households to really address that. Lady Mary Lygon defended her brother against a cascade of innuendo around his sexuality without it ever being explicitly named. But the adoration of the pair in artistic circles points to the existence of a thriving countercultural society in Sydney as it was changing from a colonial to an imperial city, a place already much bigger than nationalist imaginings such as Norton's. On becoming political resources in public debates, the Loftus' divorce saga did feed into the public discourses around the divorce bill and gave a human face to the terrible consequences for women deserted by their husbands at this time. And the Sydney nationalists used the Lygons as a straw man or a straw couple in their campaigns for a certain particular type of Australian identity, casting them as the very opposite of a manly, white, secular and independent Australia. On the question about imposters, Lady Loftus was no imposter, but neither did she dispel the picture painted of her as a noble woman fallen on hard times. She let certain social expectations of a woman in her viceroyal role obscure the real influence that she could exert. Paradoxically, the Lygons were expected to behave in certain viceroyal ways, especially in dispensing hospitality to the Sydney elite, but instead they played themselves as themselves, and that reality was unexpected and confronting to a combination of nationalist tabloids, inflamed society matrons, and Sydney evangelicals, who made it their mission to harry and expel the Lygons from Government House. Because they have to ask who then really were the imposters. So in summary, scandal can be amusing and titillating and even embarrassing. But if we instead seek to read scandals against the grain, we can find unexpected insights into the ways society has functioned in the past and how influence has been exerted within it, especially in unseen ways, and what are its resonances today. Australian history is, I think, incomplete if the government houses and their viceregal consorts are left out of our history books. Thank you.